Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I'm happy to welcome you to a presentation on Chinese intelligence programs and the U.S. response. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Colonel Edward Barr. Colonel Edward Barr served throughout Southeast Asia and the Middle East as the senior military HUMINT, which is Human Intelligence, and Counterintelligence Officer J2X in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Djibouti. From 2007 to 2009, he served as U.S. Central Command's Senior Counterintelligence and HUMINT Officer, responsible for intelligence operations in 27 countries. He retired in 2010 after 30 years of service and worked for several years with the FBI as task force officer. After graduation from Providence College, he served 5 years as an infantry officer in the Marine Corps before earning a JD and a master's degree from George Washington University. Working as an attorney in Washington, D.C., and joining the Central Intelligence Agency as an operations officer. Soon after September 11, 2001, Colonel Barr was recalled to active duty and thus began his extraordinary career in military intelligence. Last year, Colonel Barr spoke to our group and gave an illuminating talk on human intelligence and counterintelligence activities in the Middle East. Today, he'll discuss China's intelligence operations, a topic of global importance. We are happy to once again welcome Colonel Ed Barr.
So thank you, Linda, for that nice introduction. And again, it's my pleasure being back here again. And I just want to reiterate what Jim was saying about the benefits of in-person, face-to-face education, communication, and training. We've seen that at Northeastern University, where I am teaching. And while the online experience is good, nothing really beats the face-to-face communication. And of course, with your organization, the benefits of getting together with fellow veterans and folks interested in veterans affairs. So I wanted to start that off. I also want to mention that I did watch Professor Nye's program on China that was earlier in the year. And what he did was kind of give a macro level strategic look at China and kind of how things developed as far as our US policy towards China. Because since World War II, China has had exponential growth, both as an economic and a military power. So I think it's good background, if anyone didn't see that, to maybe go back and listen to what Professor Nye had to say about China. And what I'm going to be talking about is more of the tactical. Well, I'll talk a little bit about the strategic impact, but really looking at tactically what we have to do to combat the threat from the Chinese Communist Party. And I say Chinese Communist Party because I really think that's what I want you to understand when I say China or Chinese. If you look at the challenges that the US has pertaining to the communist government over there, it's much more difficult to be a Chinese citizen. So when I say China, Chinese, think Chinese Communist Party, and I'll try to clarify that. So let me share my screen and get into my slides. So we talk about Chinese intelligence programs. It's a rather large topic, and what I'll try to do is provide you a basic understanding about what the threat is on the strategic level, and then get down into the more nitty-gritty about operations that I have done and our intelligence community is doing today to protect the nation. And we'll cover a wide gamut from military to economics and everything in between, to include cyber, of course. And I hope at the end of this presentation, where there will be time for questions, that you really will get a good understanding about what the China threat is, how we got here, and maybe a few comments from myself about what I personally believe we can do to try to meet the challenge. So I wanted to start off by taking a look at some of the strategic and the real macro level specifics. Now, everything that I talk about today is available on the open source. Within the intelligence community, we call this open source intelligence. It's technically information until it's analyzed, but I'm going to call it open source intelligence because I did a little bit of analysis myself. And China's entry into the World Trade Organization really set the stage for their economic growth. And at that time, everyone truly believed that it would be a good thing. Now, the overall level thought was that if we bring China into really the post-World War II Western European dominated economic system, that they would modify their behavior. Of course, they became communist shortly after World War II, and they remain one of the probably the most powerful communist nation in the world. Without a doubt, they are. So we were hoping that this would bring them more towards the Western model of governance, not just economic, but also in governance. Remember at that time when they entered the World Trade Organization that Russia had recently come back to being after the fall of the Soviet Union and all the numerous countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union. So the mindset was, hey, if the Soviet Union fell and they're trying to get back into the global network, the global economy, then so would China. And at that time, one of the few years between my time with CIA and back in uniform doing intelligence work, I was back in Boston doing some business, some teaching, and using my law degree a little bit. And I remember that time I had gone on missions over to civilian economic commercial missions over to the former Soviet Union and hosted a number of Chinese delegations that were coming to New England through the Rhode Island Economic Development Center, the Massachusetts Trade Office, Vermont Trade Office, and really New England working together to try to help bring China in. But if you see what happened, you take a look, you see that China has been far more successful in coming into our system than we have in competing to China, where our trade deficit just keeps on growing. More concerning from a national security perspective is the Chinese domination in what's called rare earth minerals. And again, some of this is just a matter of what natural resources a country has, but also there's the economic considerations of how much money it takes to mine in the US or Canada, vice in China. And of course, we all know labor costs are, a fraction of what they are here. So on the business model and on the governmental model, it was seen as, okay, let's get China into our system and good things will happen. There was actually even talk, you may remember, that a prosperous China is good for America. Whether that was ever true, I'm not sure, but I think if we all look at it today with hindsight, we will see probably not. And the main reason is they have not really moderated their behavior. And rare earth minerals is probably one of the more dominant areas that China has over us. And you see that where most of our imports come from. Now, what is also happening is at the same time that we are totally reliant on China for rare earth minerals, rare earth metals and minerals, is they're slowing down production. And you will see this even in the precious metals, where China is trying to gather the gold and the silver. And there's good reasons for that. So this was an interesting slide. So I said that what my research was done on open source intelligence. That means it's intelligence that anyone can get to, or just information on the net. And I told my students at Northeastern, you really have to dig deep. Don't just take a look at these, at the initial information you come across. Find out who the source is, who is financially backing the group or the website. And this is a good case in point. So I had heard during the high COVID situation that, well, we're over-reliant on antibiotics, and China can just shut it off and put us in a whole world of hurt. So I found this slide. I said, well, that's really not too bad. And again, it was 2019 and things have changed a little, but it takes time for data to be gathered. But I looked and I found out that this particular slide was developed by the pharmaceutical industry. So I dug a little deeper and I found out that, yes, only 36% of our antibiotics come from China. However, nearly all of our antibiotics have some precursor chemicals that depend on China. So that would look at the 36 in blue. And if you put those two together, that's pretty scary about the control. So I'm going through some of these to show you where China is and why they are a threat to us. So you would think with all of these decades, or let's say the last 2.5 decades, let's say after the entrance into the World Trade Organization, which was in 2001. So we've had 2 decades to see what's going on. And of course, things change very slowly. Well, you would have thought, and especially 2020, 2021, that's some COVID time, right? And we're kind of figuring out China is not really our friend. They have control over vast pieces of our economy. The global supply chain issues are due in part to our reliance on overseas manufacturers. But that has not stopped the US from investing in China. Foreign direct investment just means that US dollars, US money is going into China and into Chinese companies. So you see that despite the totally domination in certain sectors by China, it hasn't really bothered our businesses as far as direct investment. So we'll get into that a little greater detail. Now, Linda mentioned that I talked a little bit about human intelligence and counterintelligence. I'm going to talk a brief bit about it today for those of you who weren't here, because you need to understand what is going on with Chinese Communist Party spying and trying to steal secrets from the US. So human intelligence is really the offense in the intelligence game. It's traditionally thought of as CIA case officers. Don't think of James Bond. That's not how it is. But it is professional intelligence officers who get tasked by their government to try to steal secrets or acquire secrets in whatever way they can. And we say human intelligence because there's a good deal of information that cannot be gathered from technical means. And the big thing that technical means of collection, such as satellites, imagery analysis, and so on, is intentions. So human intelligence had been, and just let me say, human intelligence is always supported by technology. But basically, the human intelligence officer has to spot someone who can get the information he needs, do some assessment to believe, to see, confirm that in fact it would be a good target. Then they develop them in a variety of ways. Then they recruit them. And there's also a variety of ways. They could recruit them saying, hey, I'm working for the US or I'm working for China. Or they could say, I'm working for China when they're really working for the US, or they could say, I work for company ABC when I'm really working for a government. And then once there's an agreement in place and the individual is going to do the bidding of the intel officer, then they have to manage, make sure that they are acquiring the proper information, the right information, and so on. So bottom line, human intelligence, they steal stuff. Counterintelligence are the ones trying to stop those human guys. So they want to do everything they can to prevent their adversaries from stealing. So if you boil it down to one side is trying to spy and the other side is trying to prevent them to spy. So I covered this a little bit, and I want to highlight the word clandestinely. So the human officers, the spies, don't want to be known. You don't want to be in, you don't want to get your name in public. You don't want to come and have this in the newspaper. So everything is done there is done secretively. We call it classified. We're working in a classified environment. Well, that makes it more challenging for the counterintelligence guys. So in the US, the primary human organization is the CIA. However, the military has a good deal of human collectors as well. On the counterintelligence side, the number one group is the FBI. Although to further confuse people, CIA also has counterintelligence officers, but what they do primarily is to ensure and look at an operation from the adversary's counterintelligence eyes. So the highlighted is what counterintelligence seeks to do is protect the secrets of the US intel community. I would add the government as a whole, and then to protect the nation's critical assets. And again, within the United States, the FBI is in charge of pursuing spies. And we'll take a little closer look at that. So we learned that the FBI takes a look at trying to track the spies, keep control on them. We'll look at some examples there. What's challenging about the Chinese Communist Party's intelligence structure is it's kind of like ours, but it's not really like ours. And it's the same challenge that Western nations have to face when dealing with communist nations, or if you want, democracies against totalitarian regimes, where there's just not that line of demarcation between what is the government and what is not the government. Now, the Ministry of State Security is kind of the big dog. So it really has attributes of the FBI, whereas it takes control over operations within the Republic of China, and it also conducts operations overseas. Now, as I mentioned again, this is all open source and you can find this and verify it. Their main goal is targeting the US. That makes perfect sense to me. The US is China's biggest adversary. The US has all the money, all the technology, and they have what's called an all of government approach. Now, we try to do something similar, but again, we have inherent constraints because when you look at all of government approach from a Chinese perspective, it really means all of society. It means the entire nation, because the Chinese Communist Party is in charge of everything that happens in China, unlike us. So it really makes it challenging for the FBI. Now, there's also a number of military organizations. Not unlike us, China's military has intelligence capabilities. Just a note on the US capability, we call it the US intelligence community. There are 17 different agencies and departments that are part of that. There are the large ones you know about, NSA, CIA, FBI, and then there's also smaller ones, Treasury, for example. The Coast Guard's relatively small. They just came into the IC formally about a decade ago. But the People's Liberation Army really encompasses all of their, what we would call armed services. And within that, the controlling entity is the General Staff Department. And they take care of anything within any of their services. And so they are not unlike our military, only it's really even a little more centralized. We're very centralized now as far as operations, but we still have separate military departments. Now, even though that they have this capability, most of it is done within China. Now that's kind of odd because our military is not supposed to do anything within the US and it's supposed to be separate. They do use what are their defense attaches, and these are overt intelligence officers placed at Chinese embassies around the world. We do the exact same thing. I conduct training for a lot of government intelligence entities. And again, in this area, China is no different than us. What is different is all of the other organizations. Now, you may have heard of past transgressions by CIA, military intelligence about using news reporters and so on. Technically, there's a waiver to everything in the US government, but we really aren't supposed to use the media and the press for anything in intelligence operations. And in my career, I didn't come close to doing that. We didn't even consider it in anything I'd done, whether it's CIA, the military, or FBI. So as far as the rank and file, we really do try to follow that. They also have Overseas Chinese Affairs Office. And this is what makes it challenging for the FBI because there is all of these entities. There are new China news agencies here in the US. There are overseas Chinese offices here. And then you have the Ministry of Education, and they're supposed to monitor all of the activities of the Chinese overseas. And that is an amazing number of people to track. Maybe the most interesting is United Front Work Department. And this is a quote from Mao Zedong. Mao said, "To mobilize the party's friends to strike at the party's enemies." And they are here in the US, and they are tied to the Confucius Institutes. And we'll take a quick look about what they are. A couple of other areas I want to highlight just to let you know really what an all-encompassing challenge this is, because it's not just going up against another military or even it's not like the CIA against KGB. Not even the Soviets had an all of society intelligence network. Now, when I say they have an all of society intelligence network in the People's Republic of China, I don't mean they're all formal intelligence officers. What I mean is they access all aspects of their society in order to gather information to develop intelligence on their adversaries, primarily the US. So this is one I call the carrot, and it's called talent plans. And they recruit people, primarily science and technology professors, research students. And again, we'll see how this ties into academia. And they hold them to secrecy. They reward them for the information they gather. And it's something that really, from a traditional intelligence collection standpoint, we had never really seen before. Now, the stick is a pursuit. And you won't be happy to know that the Chinese government has set up 32, basically, police offices around the world, to include one in New York City. This just came out by a Spain human rights organization, and this is only a couple of months old. So going back to the overall strategic view that we're going to try to bring them into our orbit, we're going to try to make the Chinese act more like us. It doesn't appear to have been too successful, even though it is through hindsight and the initial beliefs of pretty much all of the political power brokers and elites in the US agreed. Now I think they should rethink that. Why do I say that? Well, here's the FBI perspective, and I took this specifically from their website, their counterintelligence division. So they say it's a grave threat. Now, in intelligence parlance, that's the highest threat. We have, similar to the classification system, where a top secret information is released, it's a grave threat to national security. It just goes down from there. So the FBI claims it's a grave threat. And it is FBI's top counterintelligence priority. So this is not just me saying it should be, and I wholeheartedly believe it should be. And I want to focus on the next line because we're going to see how this may be employed, where the Chinese government is employing tactics that seek to influence lawmakers and public opinion to achieve policies that are more favorable to China. So that means they're trying to target our political class. So they target businesses, academic institutions, research institutes, lawmakers, and the general public. And there's that whole of society response. So we're going to try that, but the FBI has far little control over people supporting their counterintelligence efforts than the Chinese do. In case in point, when I was with FBI Tampa division, and I was involved with some outreach to the business community, usually the business community was fairly responsive. Academia was usually not responsive. And again, academic freedom, the free flow of exchange and ideas. And in my opinion, one of the biggest reasons why academia loves to have Chinese or any foreign students is because they pay full freight. They pay 100%. They don't get all of the scholarships that US citizens do. So that is my personal opinion, but obviously the FBI recognizes that. And it was really disappointing for me to see some of the responses that we got. But it's not atypical, my experience. So we're going to do a little case study here. And this case study focuses on a particular stream. We're going to look at lawmakers. So what I'm doing here is I am putting myself as a Chinese intelligence officer. Knowing what I know about what China is trying to gather, what type of information, we just heard a little bit from FBI about what they're trying to do. So I am going to act as that Chinese intelligence officer and demonstrate how a target is worked. So there's something called the human cycle. And I went through it briefly in the slide, spotting, assessing, developing, recruiting, and managing. So we're going to take a look at how really those first few elements come into play. Now, I do this with private sector companies because, again, as we learned, and we'll see in greater detail, it's not only government secrets that China is after. In fact, I would say it's more commercial secrets, and they have been tremendously successful in that. So, for example, I did this type of analysis for a Boston venture capital fund who was trying to figure out how their information was being released. So what I did was, let me go back to the beginning and see in their network whom I would target using the same type of analysis. And this also happens quite frequently with other businesses. There's a huge amount of fraud coming from China, and they're really pretty sophisticated because they know how to prey on entrepreneurs' belief in their product or their process. And they try to come in like white knights and say, we will take over, we will fund your business. And then they have some really unique ways. So it appears as if the funds are in your bank, and they're really not. And actually, as we speak, I'm working with one company And they're supposed to have $500 million in their bank account today. So we'll see how that goes. I wish I was able to report prior to this webinar. So let's go into this, and I want to walk you through, because this is exactly what is done in human intelligence. Obviously by us, I was trained by the US and also by China. So I determined that I'm looking to recruit someone from who's a lawmaker. Okay, we learned that they're targeting our political class. So, okay, Beijing tells me you need to find someone who's an up and comer who would be amenable to working with us. And I looked at the federal and I looked at the state. And I decided that federal might be a better way to go. That's not always the case, depending on the particular requirement that the Chinese are looking for. For example, I'm currently in Florida. I'm right on the Space Coast. If they were looking for someone, if they were looking to target our space industry, which they are, they may decide to focus on someone on the state level. But I'm for this case study, we're going to look at the federal level. And then there's a decision, should it go the Senate or the House of Representatives? Well, usually the people in the Senate are a little more established. They only have to run for re-election every 6 years, vice every 2 years. So I'm looking at the House of Representatives, because also it's much easier to influence someone who's running every 2 years and is at the House level, where the funding may not have to be as much as it may be if you're trying to support a senatorial candidate. And then I'm looking for some committees. Now, those of you who know our government know that the oddly named Ways and Means is really the most important committee in Congress. Also appropriations, money is always good. And then in intelligence. Now, I might have tried to focus on the intelligence committees if the requirement was to try to develop a mole, try to recruit someone within the intel agencies or one of the related groups that work with them. Then I said, okay, well, I want to make good use of my time. So I want to do something. I want to focus on someone who's from a safe district. That means overwhelmingly Democrat or overwhelmingly Republican. So pretty much, you know that party is going to win, because you don't want to gamble when you're in the intel business. You are gambling. You're never going to get more than 80% of the information you need, but you want to do your best to minimize those risks. And then from an important state. And again, I mentioned Florida, the space industry. The important states are usually the largest with the most biggest economies in technology. And then I want them to be favorable. They don't have to be exactly in love with People's Republic of China, but I want them to have an interest in Chinese or Asian organizations and so on. So we're looking at a Chinese congressman. And I've taken a look at one, and they have a number of favorite issues. There's really a couple that could be of interest to Chinese. Actually, a lot of them, I would say manufacturing, environmental challenges would come next. There might be some hooks we could get into there. But I looked at education. Then I looked where this individual went to school, went to University of Southern California, and then a master's at University of Arizona. People normally have a little stronger ties to their undergraduate experience and university. So I said, okay, let's go with that. That should say USC Chinese Nexus, and there are similar Chinese groups at virtually any major land grant college, any major university, to include all throughout Boston. So there's a Chinese Union, and all of these have little twists about what they do, but in general, they all are, if not pro-China, they're at least trying to develop ties and open up communication. Because remember, communication bringing people together. That was the whole goal of the US decision makers when we decided to try to engage China especially after they came into the World Trade Organization. Now, another reason I picked California congressperson is because China has a whole department. Well, we actually have proof, open source proof, that they had a department. I believe they still do. And it makes perfect sense. California by itself is the 9th largest economy in the world, if you make it a country. There's a real Asian focus. I lived in California for a number of years, and it's much more focused toward Asia than the East Coast, which is more towards Europe. So to me, it just seemed like a good way to go. And this individual is a member of a couple of caucuses that are of interest. Now, the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, that might be kind of suspect. But I still thought, well, we can still move forward. We could leverage some of the other ones. And I looked at travel and tourism as something. So the point is, the Chinese intelligence collector is trying to find someone whom he can develop a legitimate means to contact in an area of mutual interest. And that's what we're doing with this case study. Then, if we have an individual identified, we try to look what we call vulnerabilities. Does this individual need money? It's another reason I selected a congressman rather than a senator. Senators usually have more money, so that potential vulnerability may not exist as readily. Do they have family issues? Everyone has family issues, but it's something that intelligence people look at. And then passionate causes, and really anything that I can use as a hook. Now, a vulnerability doesn't really mean that there's anything wrong. I mean, this individual could have Asian heritage and just loves the region. So it doesn't mean there's anything bad. A vulnerability just could be something that you are, and it's not a bad thing, but it's something that an intel officer will try to exploit. The next thing is trying to develop a nexus. Now, there very likely could be a nexus with some of those Chinese-focused groups at the university. And the key is to try to find up a way not to scare off the target. And probably when you're going after a congressman, you don't even want to go after the target directly. It would be probably more beneficial to target someone in their near orbit, someone close, maybe even a chief of staff or some senior staffer who can then provide you, the bona fides, you being the intelligence officer, with a means to get close. So I came up with this sample plan. We'll select the most advantageous of those Chinese organizations. And all organizations always need funding, especially if they're academically focused, not-for-profits, groups like veterans groups. Everyone needs funds. So you find a way to funnel money to the organization. You might sponsor an event or you attend an event. You make it known to someone in the staff that you or your organization are the ones contributing funds. You're treated very nicely, and you take your time. Now, one thing the Chinese do well is, well, they do a lot of things well, but they also are a lot more patient than we are. They're a lot more patient than me. So this may take several months or years. And years is probably more accurate because they try to, even if they have not targeted an individual, they try to keep tabs on the up and comers. So that's how we're going to try to do it. This happens all the time. You can just go into any open source web browser and type in Chinese spying, and you're going to get overwhelmed with responses. So let's see if this works. Have there any close ties of anyone in government with China? It's pretty much everyone. And as you see, it's not Democrat, it's not Republican, it's the power brokers. If there's a common denominator to the current and former members of Congress or the government who have close ties to China, it's their power brokers, and that's it. Now, some of them came from money, some of them made money while in office, but again, it's very easy to find out, and it's kind of overwhelming when you look at it, because this is not a comprehensive list by any means. The same thing goes for the business community. This is like our top companies. And what I have seen in the last 10, 15 years, well, since I started doing more of the commercial counterintelligence, is you'll notice that a lot of businesses, they no longer say the US businesses. Remember during World War II, how closely the business community worked with the government on the war effort. You're not seeing that. In fact, most companies say we're not American companies, we're international companies. And this certainly shows by how they operate. Now, I was working with actually a Boston-based tech company that provided technical intelligence support to the US government. They were getting their data through the use of technology by one of these companies listed here. When they heard that this company was passing the data off to the US military, they cut them off. At the same time, that company was providing critical technology to the Chinese surveillance system. Now, why would they do that? In my opinion, they look at the potential market size in China, vice in the US. And if China keeps developing at the pace it will, from a business perspective, you want to go where the market is. But it was kind of shocking to me. This occurred just about 7, 8 years ago. You see, the former chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, General Dunford, said the work that Google is doing in China is indirectly benefiting the Chinese military. I would say directly. Now, we'll take a look at how China forces US companies to operate there. But for a number of reasons, I'm going to bump that up to directly. For all of them, not just for Google. So how does Wall Street act? Well, the same way, probably for the same reason. And some of the statements that those people made really can chill you if you know what China is up to. But similarly to what we saw with the politicians, all of these people are power brokers. And that's really the common denominator. Same thing with former diplomats, pardon the extra E. This started off way back in Kissinger, who you may remember under President Nixon, he's the one that, quote, opened up China. So from the beginning, he has been making tons of money. William Cohen, again, Republican who worked in Democratic administrations. It does not matter, right, left, Republican, Democrat. Our power brokers are making a lot of money. Well, is that in the past? Not really. November 1 to 3 of this year, not that long ago, what was it, last week, a week and a half ago, 200 financial leaders representing all of the top financial companies met in Hong Kong. We all know what's going on in Hong Kong. Not too good if you're a Chinese citizen. And they shared the stage with individuals who were sanctioned by the US for the Chinese crackdown. They're international companies, they're not US companies. This is the common denominator, in my opinion. I think I can prove it, because all of those power brokers have made a lot of money. Of course, the US middle class has shrunk and we've lost manufacturing. So I think it's just interesting because it's a challenge to the FBI to try to combat this when you have so many power brokers are not that eager to upset the Chinese apple cart. So remember I said that I would say these companies are directly benefiting the Chinese military? Because what happens at times, they have to, a US foreign partner, any foreign partner, has to work with a Chinese company. So the foreign partner, the US company, cannot be the majority shareholder. So I just saw one of the big computer makers did this, and they were accused of supporting some nefarious activity. They said, oh, it wasn't us. We're minority shareholders in that company. They were 49% shareholders. So that's one way that they kind of technically say, well, we're not supporting the repression. We're just going, that's we're part of the company, but we don't control it. And of course, there's no surprise that China is a tough nut to crack. Another New England story, in those years between CIA and going back in uniform, I worked to promote international trade, do some trade work, and I did do a number of trips over to Asia, to China. I was in China 6 months prior to Hong Kong going over to them, 6 months after. There was no difference. China waited until they thought they had the advantage to take action and cracking down on Hong Kong. Well, anyway, I had this poor little entrepreneur came in and said, I just sent this product over that I created to get manufactured in China. And all of a sudden there were all these knockoffs being sold, and it's put me out of business. Well, we all hear of the theft of intellectual property. That was kind of the early days. Again, it was not that long after China came in the World Trade Organization. We thought China had opened up, and they were trying to do deals left and right, and didn't really know the details. But it is actually that little cylinder with pins. That's kind of a universal screwdriver type thing. It just covers that. It was actually someone, a New England inventor. I forget, it used to be called the Gator Grip, but now it's ubiquitous all over the TVs, and this poor guy, he lost it all. And many of these challenges have been going on for a while, but again, I think it's getting worse and worse. The good thing is we're opening our eyes a little bit. So to bring this back to Chinese espionage. So I try to set the stage. Here's what we thought we were doing. Here's the results of what we're doing. Here's maybe why we're not doing that much, because the power brokers are doing just fine by that relationship. Remember, we saw the foreign direct investment didn't slow down during COVID, even though all the US firms are shut and businesses are closed. The investment in China kept going up, even though they were closed. Well, here's the espionage, which is why I've been trying to get people's attention on this issue. So the 170 cases cited, and this was since 2010, I believe. 42% were Chinese military government employees, easy. 32% private citizens. And when I go back again, I want you to think this is all from the Chinese Communist Party. It's not from the Chinese people. And many times, as I mentioned, the Chinese people are the most injured. Remember that office that keeps track of overseas Chinese citizens? Well, they were involved in a lot of these cases. So who knows how they're manipulating these poor people who they coerce into spying for them. Now, the non-Chinese actors were usually US persons recruited by China. So we went through kind of that recruitment, the recruitment process. 34% military technology, 51% commercial technology. It makes eminent good sense for the Chinese to steal technology. You can see by all the statistics how their economy has burgeoned over the last couple of decades. It costs far less to set up some spying operations and steal information rather than investing in research and development. It's just the way it is. And you can't blame them if you were a Communist Party official, you would say that's a pretty good investment. 16% US civilian agencies and politicians, and the growing is 41% cyber espionage, and usually by state-affiliated groups. But what this doesn't mention is over 1,200 cases of corporate espionage being brought by US firms. There's a video that was made on Chinese corporate espionage in 2012 called Death by China. And I was working with FBI Tampa Division, and one of the folks involved with that was part of that. This individual, his company made kind of neon lighting, and it was when that technology was, I guess, kind of cutting edge, or he was at the cutting edge of that. And the Chinese stole it, just like the other example I made. And he asked the FBI to help. My friends in the FBI said, we really didn't help him much, but he would still go with us to try to tell the story and educate businesses. But he fought it. He fought it. He spent everything he owned. He fought it, and he actually won. I mean, it was quite interesting. I probably should have emphasized his case a little bit more. But if you look at Death by China, it's almost 10 years old now, but it's still very appropriate. In fact, it's probably more challenging for us today. So, and think of the numbers when you think of the FBI and all that the FBI has to do. So each FBI field office has a number of squads. So I was on the Foreign Counterintelligence Squad. So, you know, we had maybe a dozen full-time, part-time people, staff working there. And we had to cover 1/3 of Florida. And it wasn't just espionage. It was, you know, terrorists. It was foreign trade delegations coming in, trade shows, the military bases throughout the region. There was just a lot to cover, and it's a numbers game, and we don't do too well on the numbers game. Speaking of numbers, 80% of all economic espionage prosecutions brought by the DOJ would benefit the Chinese state. China, 60% of all trade secret theft cases. Just to let you know, the other usual suspects you probably figured out are Russia, Iran, North Korea, and sometime our friends, India on occasion I've seen, France I've seen, and Israel I've seen in my career. So it's mainly China, and you know, next would probably be Russia, and then Iran, and then it's a bunch of folks. And again, friends spy on friends. October 24th, there you can go read that. Multiple cases against Chinese intelligence officers. So it just happened to work out that there's all kind of activity. It usually is going on in the press right when we're doing these talks. And what happened when the US cracked down a little bit, just a little bit in 2020, is all of these researchers from US universities and research agencies started leaving the country, because with the new policies, they knew they were going to get cracked down upon. Let's get to some predictions, because I know I'm painting a dire picture, and I think it is a dire situation. I think that China will continue to do what it does unless there's significant pushback. I talked about Hong Kong. Why did they take such strong action against Hong Kong? Because they determined that the pushback from the US and the West and the rest of the world would be acceptable. They had set the stage really over the last, since they became a country, but especially since they became economically prosperous, where they used their money to work with key power brokers, not only of the US, but of all countries. I mentioned the Trudeaus, long-time relationship there. So because of that, I don't think there's going to be direct US-China conflict in the near term. For good or for bad, I'd say more for bad from my perspective. There are too many power brokers who are too tied to China. You remember the list from every community, never mind academia, the amount of investment that's still going in there, and they'll just say, well, we have to lower the profile. Now, very interestingly, as we speak today, the two presidents are actually meeting, and they're discussing some of the national geopolitical issues. And of course, the big one is always Taiwan. Taiwan is such a tricky case because, again, we recognize there's only one China. China has used that policy agreement that we made to go around the world and pretty much buy off little countries so they don't have formal ties with Taiwan. So the Taiwanese are in real tough shape. And the Chinese will accept verbal spats with the US as long as it's not followed up with action. So the old adage, look at what they do, not what they say, is very important here. Now, what I do when looking at China to see if anything is brewing is I go to the Taiwan press, and Taiwanese have some English language papers, and you can find some info. What Taiwan does is whatever the Chinese try to suppress, they focus on. So the Taiwanese were aware of COVID earlier because they saw that it was being suppressed, and it was, the Chinese Communist Party was trying to say nothing to see here, move along. Yep, no problems here. As soon as that happened, Taiwan said, "Uh-oh, there's a problem." I think that's a good way to go. So there's kind of some good news. I do mention, though, just as they determined that there'd be little pushback against moving against Hong Kong, I think they'll do the same thing. I think they'll see these Kamoya Matsui. These are small islands very close to the Chinese Communist mainland, controlled by Taiwan. So I think they might do something there first before they do a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. Again, they take their time. They took their time with Hong Kong. They'll take their time. They're doing so well economically and not getting any pushback. What they've done I mentioned the Spratly Islands. They're pretty much bullying all of the Southeast Asian nations, claiming that they own all of that open sea, and they're building islands, and they're putting military equipment on there. Nothing's been done. Occasionally we'll sail some ships there, show the flag, freedom of the seas, but we really haven't done anything. So I think they'll be patient. So what could we do? Well, these are some ideas, and the key thing is the political will. Now, the political will has to come first and foremost before anything will happen. And that's what makes it challenging. So the FBI jumps up and down, says Chinese, the #1 counterintelligence threat. But you have all of the more influential decision makers who have ties to China, and they don't want to rock the boat. Now, we can establish more reporting requirements for universities involved with Confucius Institute. We used to have that, but that was kind of reeled back, and there's been some changes in that involvement. And I told you, because that's an area that the FBI has a very difficult time working. There's really only been a couple of premier cases that people point to, and I would point to when I was with them, and the case University of Tennessee, and there's even some stuff that happened at Harvard recently. I think it was in the chemistry department. So I'll let you take a look at that, see what happened there. And then we got to get a handle on the joint research projects. Now we see there's a lot of these going on, and I don't think we have a good handle of it. Banned lobbying of Chinese military and intel linked companies. I put this down, but this is probably the most problematic because there's no easy way to determine if it's a Chinese government or a Chinese private sector. They really have no private sector in that. They do have to report everything to the Chinese government, whereas we don't. When I worked for CIA, we would get some companies that would provide us intelligence if they were, say, working in parts of the Middle East where they would just come in and say, hey, you guys might want to know this. We didn't ask, they would come to us. The Chinese communist intel people ask their companies. Balancing the playing field, we talked a little bit about that, about how companies have to be minority shareholders in Chinese companies. And if we just had an equal playing field, I think that may be a more doable of all of these suggestions that I have. And then I don't think we're going to get urge media companies to offer objective analysis because there's just too much money coming from China now. So I think of all of these, I think we probably could get away with number 4 first. So there's a lot of challenges. We still are the more powerful country. We really didn't know, in my opinion, what we were doing when we so embraced China that we would actually say a prosperous and powerful China is in the best interest of the US. I would hope that now, just a cursory look at some of the data that was provided here today would be enough to get people to say, maybe we need to reevaluate our relationship with communist China. And of course, I didn't even get into the human rights violations that are going on. And if you look at the money, the US is kind of supporting all of communist China's activities. With that, the big question remains. So now you guys can take out your rifles and start shooting at me with some good questions.
Okay, thank you. Wait a minute. This one. Thank you, Ed. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Ed. Is this loud enough?
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
Good. I hope you are all ready with your questions. Bob, Lewis, and I will handle the questions in this room. And Matt will take care of the questions on Zoom. While Matt walks over to his monitor, we are going to start with the first question in the room. Talk right up to the mic.
Hi, my name is Bill Bruins. A couple of weeks ago, Xi got himself reelected for another 50 or 100 years in China. And the first thing that happened was the Chinese stock market went down hugely. And the second thing that happened was that the Chinese renminbi went down hugely. I have a sense that they're shooting themselves in the foot, and it's not what you addressed, but would you like to comment on that?
Well, yes, first of all, I think it looks like he's going to be a president for life. And so that shows that our goal to bring them more into a more, we didn't expect them to be democratic overnight, but a more Western type governance has failed, in my opinion. That the stock market went down. I think it is going to be more challenging to hold China together. One of the problems they have is, as the economy has expanded and the middle class has expanded, certain people, now you have to be approved, so to speak, by the Communist Party to have certain rights. You probably all heard of the social credit scores. You say nice things about the party and you get benefits. But I can foresee there being some internal challenges that they may not expect, and a heavy hand may hurt them. It's the old adage, if you hold water in your hand and you squeeze it and it comes out. So hopefully that was a positive sign of some kind of a brief show of no confidence in the creation of a de facto, if he wants to be president for life. Thank you.
Another question here in the room.
Hi, my name is Guy Podcat, and just in passing, this isn't my question. The Harvard chemistry professor that you mentioned is actually a Lexington resident on Merriam Hill, and he's kind of a case study on how any government would recruit an asset. And in his case, it wasn't a money problem so much as your typical, and this is my opinion, academic resentment of watching his students become millionaires and billionaires while he's basically getting by on an academic salary. But that's neither here nor there. So my question is this: the question about the current meeting going on in Asia, Biden, Australia, with respect to Taiwan, why is it that we don't see more unity between our position and that of Australia, Japan, South Korea? It seems to me that they would be very interested to know, what China's intentions are vis-a-vis Taiwan, and we should be presenting kind of a unified position there. But I'm not seeing it. I'm just wondering if you are, and what the manifestation of that unity is. Thanks.
Thank you. I a little bit broke up, but I think I heard it was pertaining to why isn't there unanimity between our allies on the Taiwanese issue? Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
So think of geography, first of all. Think about where they are. They have a much closer response. If there was going to be any issues, there'll be a much closer response to them. There's also in a lot, not so much Australia, but if you look at the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, all those nations, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on, their economic power brokers are ethnic Chinese. And we saw how the People's Republic of China can really manipulate what they call overseas Chinese. So I really can't answer that from a national security perspective, speaking for these countries. But I think it goes back to the old adage that where you stand is based on where you sit. And they're sitting in a much more precarious place in the world than we are. And they have different interests too. And there's still, from what I saw my time over there on business and in the Marine Corps, I don't know if this ties to it, but Japan was the real threat to a lot of those countries because of the impact of World War II. And it really was interesting to me in some of the other Asian nations I've visited, where they almost were more careful about dealing with Japan than China. No, I think that's gone by the wayside as China's gone up in power. But those are a couple of thoughts. And I know that's an inexact and theoretical response, but I think I would just offer that.
Our next question is going to come from Zoom, and then, sir, you're going to be next.
So there's a question from the chat. Please comment on how U.S. is policing Chinese investments in USA companies.
One more time, Matt.
Louder, Matt.
Please comment on how well CFI U.S. is policing Chinese investments in USA companies. Are you able to?
Not good. I'm gonna.
Maybe
Is it? I'm looking at the Q&A. Is it one of those?
It's in the chat. It's I think you can hear me better up here. Please comment on how well CFI U.S. is policing Chinese investments in USA companies.
Oh, okay. I see that. Yeah. We're not doing very well. And I mentioned we are in a losing battle in the numbers game. So for example, I was working in support of Tampa Division with a retired special agent. He was the lead on providing guidance support to US companies on all commercial espionage, not just China, but of course China was the number one because they're the number one that go after us. They eliminated his position in 2015, 2016. No one else is doing that now. It's an additional job by an active duty special agent. So I think the challenge goes, and where we do pay attention is when it is Chinese ownership. So, and I think it's a priority. It's probably the best we can do. If companies are getting involved and investing in the US, that's going to go forward. But if they're establishing themselves as a maybe even a significant or majority shareholder, and they'll come up with a variety of interesting ways to do this, whether they'll have front companies that pretend to be totally commercial, but they're actually controlled by the Chinese government. But unless China, their investment is substantial, I don't really think the intel community, counterintelligence community is looking at it too much. The people who get most support are the what I call clear defense contractors. So think of Raytheon. So Raytheon obviously deals in classified projects. So they have their own folks who have similar background to myself who will try to help them along. But they will also be able to reach out to the federal government because they have classified contracts to help them. The companies that I am really worried about and have been for a long time are those companies who have valuable technology, but do not have anyone who knows anything about counterintelligence. And I saw this. I was doing some work with Deloitte and Touche and the top 50 companies in New England, top 50 tech companies they would focus on out of the Waltham campus. And they would put all kind of money into firewalls, hardware and software, but they totally ignored the insider threat. And as we saw earlier, it's usually employees, former employees, or whatever who steal these secrets from our companies. But how are we doing policing investments? We're really not. Thank you.
Okay, next question in the room, Bob.
Phil Cunningham. I noticed that online the reference to Professor Lieber, our neighbor in Lexington, has been convicted of lying to Harvard University and to the federal government regarding his connections to the Chinese government and under that talent program that you mentioned. And his sentencing hearing is scheduled for January 2023, just as a matter of point of fact, I guess. And then to the question about our allies down in Southeast Asia, I've been reading, I guess, in the Wall Street Journal that there have been joint exercises involving Japan, Australia, and I don't know which of our fleets down there is participating, but I think they were at the same time that the Chinese were sending missiles into the ocean off of Taiwan. So my guess is that those allies of ours have got some conviction about the wisdom of partnering with the United States in the face of what the Chinese doing militarily. I don't know if you have been following that, if you care to comment on that as an indication of some unanimity between us and our CETO allies.
I think you're right that it does show, because again, they have the most to lose and they need us. So a number of years back, the Marine Corps established a rotational program in Darwin, Australia. And it's kind of something that we've done throughout history with different countries to try to not only show solidarity with them, but also for just the type of joint training that you talked about. These countries have come to the US and asking for help. In fact, I think some of the freedom of navigation that we had done was in response to those nations because they can't do it alone. So I would think that your assessment is correct, that I think they want to unite with the US, but they need the US or want the US to be the leader because, they can have a more challenging time dealing with the blowback than we can, especially being in that area. But yeah, I think the situation in Hong Kong has caused not only our decision makers, but also folks over there in the region, the other countries, to really say, we really need the US more than they may have wanted in the past. Although I worked with the ASEAN Council and they were always very pro-US. And in fact, Massachusetts had some great ties with the ASEAN countries when I was up there.
There's another question from Zoom. It starts with a comment. Just as a comment, we also do whole of society intelligence. When I was at GE Research, I was visited by CIA who were interested in what I was learning during my foreign trips. And then their question is, what is your opinion on 100% Tesla factory in Shanghai? It was actually funded by loans from China.
Oh yeah, I had heard of that, but I haven't looked into that in great detail. But it kind of ties to the overall theme that, these guys are all tied to China and Chinese money. And I do guarantee that because of that, there will be a lot of clamps and controls on Tesla with that. But it goes back to Tesla, they're saying, man, if we can get that market going, not only to export from there, but if they can ever get the market where they have 1 billion consumers who are purchasing their products. So as challenging as it is, you can see from a pure business standpoint that it does kind of make sense to get involved with there. I just don't think they know what they're getting into. They think, because in my opinion, I think China has proven it. You probably saw where the last president was escorted out, so what have you done for me lately? I think when the Chinese feel that they are ready, they may do something that has been done in communist regimes and just, nationalize a lot of these companies. That may be an extreme thing because I think they're getting too much out of the relationship with the West than they need to. And you notice that China takes advantage of the Western economies, yet they don't really contribute that much to more global initiatives, UN peacekeeping initiative. They'll take care of themselves, and they'll let the West and the US mainly pick up the pieces and fund a lot of these international activities, so to speak. But I would hope Tesla has looked at this very carefully, and I would hope they have some counterintelligence folks who are working for them. I would bet they do. And it was a business decision. And that's just how these business leaders are still thinking, that China is just another big market for them to exploit. And they don't really seem to consider the tactics or the goals. The goals, the Chinese are very overt about. They want to be the #1 country by 2049, by 2050. I mean, President Xi has talked about it. This is no secret. And they're to do everything possible to achieve that. They're not hiding their ambitions anymore. It's just we're still not paying attention, but I think we're getting better. Thank you.
Another question from Zoom.
Bob, did you have a question
Do
in
you
the
have
back?
a question, Bob? Okay,
There's a question in the back.
Hello, I'm Thomas Lane. At our southern border, do you think there's a large number of native Chinese people crossing the border?
I have not seen that being one of the higher ethnicities in the numbers game. I have not seen that or heard of that.
There's a question from Zoom from Gresh Lattimore. Your analysis, Ed, points to the U.S. strongly standing up for freedom of the seas and against aggressive Chinese military initiatives throughout the South China Sea area. And we must build our high seas fleet sooner than later, do you think? Thank you. I can repeat it because of it. Did you hear
Yeah.
me? Chris said, your analysis points to the U.S. strongly standing up for, does your analysis point to the U.S. strongly standing up for freedom of the seas and against aggressive Chinese military initiatives throughout the Chinese South China Sea area?
Yeah, I'm still not getting all of that, but I believe it had pertained to the freedom of the seas operations.
And aggressive Navy buildup on the US's part.
It's in the chat. It's the second question if you want to read it. Sorry.
Can you make this a little louder?
Look at that question. Oh, I see it from Gresh. Yeah. Well, I appreciate the thought, and I agree, Gresh. In fact, to show you how far we've fallen as a maritime power, which in my opinion, we are primarily a maritime power. When I was in grad school, I did my thesis on the 600 ship Navy. And I don't even think we have 200 today. So for whatever reason, and I know the powers that be will say, well, our ships could do a lot more with a lot less, but sometimes showing the flag really has an impact, and it has throughout our history as a nation. So I think that makes it more challenging, because we do want to challenge the claim that China has of controlling the whole South China Sea and the Spratly Islands, and claiming that that is their territorial waters, totally outside of any international norms. So by not having as a robust capability as we used to have, and as I think we should have, I think it makes it more of a challenge. And maybe that's what, we had talked about the joint exercises among nations in the area. It's going to be more important for us to do that. Even a country like Singapore, which is a city state, fascinating place, they actually have some great capability on the naval side, because again, Port of Singapore is one of the largest ports in the world. We're going to have to use those because, in my opinion, we let our naval capability atrophy a bit. And I'm not saying that just because I'm a Marine, but they always give us the worst accommodations on ships anyway.
Intentional.
Okay, I'm gonna keep one here. We have time for a couple more questions, and one of them is going to be from our first-time visitor, Robert.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I have two comments. One I was thinking about is anybody in the government, is there any committee that might be looking at legislation that would support monitoring, American businesses monitoring themselves to find out, what you've been teaching them, who's stealing stuff from them, but to have something that's more of a legislated requirement. And the other point was just that in the South China Sea and in military status of things, with all of these new developments in weaponry and technology that are coming along, the drone world and all of that, that now our ships are pretty exposed to these hypersonic stuff. I mean, having a big fleet may not be the answer in now or in the next 5 years. Just a comment. But back to the legislative thing, is anybody look at that? Is it plausible?
They have looked at that. And again, I don't disagree that, you don't want to put ships in harm's way. And that is a challenge. So the environment is different. But on the legislative side, there are periodic bills that come up. But the biggest challenge is, as we talked about, the difference between the Chinese government controlling their businesses and we not controlling ours. It's a really, it's like you don't really, I don't think our legislatures would want to mandate that, because again, if you mandate something, it comes with a cost and these businesses would have to absorb it. The businesses are, the FBI has some great resources at their website. But again, it's just getting people to recognize you may want to take a look at that. You may want to understand the threat. So I think legislative action in other areas, a government to government or equal playing field, things like that may be able to go forward. But as far as getting businesses, you would think it's in their own interest to keep an eye on this and try to prevent the theft of their intellectual property. But every year, the amount of money that is stolen from our companies goes up and up, and it's in the billions a year, which, as I said way back when, if you're China, it makes sense. Much easier, less costly to steal that. And to show you the level of technology theft, I mean, fighter planes, Chinese have stolen, the Russians stole the space shuttle, technical specs. I mean, these guys are really good, but legislation to force companies to do something, I don't think that'd be that big of an appetite. I would rather them put some money into, again, my friend who was let go of his position. You need more people like that to do the kind of outreach. This is kind of an outreach program to educate people on what the threat is. And, we really didn't get into what you can do to prevent it. But I think the first step is you have to know that there is an issue before you realize, oh, I better address it. Thank you.
Okay, I think our final question is going to come from Zoom. Matt.
How likely do you think it is that Chinese intelligence agents are participating or listening into this presentation?
Hi, guys. They already know who I am, so. I don't know what the capabilities are. Let's think about that. The cyber capabilities. I would not doubt they may try to have some type of AI mechanism to scrub to see when China is mentioned, China terms, and then kind of figure out if there's something they should look at. But I still say it's probably doubtful because they're probably looking at the decision makers. They don't care what I think that much. But it's an interesting point, and it's a good one. It's a great way to end this.
Okay, everybody, let's give Ed all right, who wants to ask it? Make it quick.
Tom Lane. It's alleged that fentanyl is produced in China. It travels the way of the border. It comes across, it has killed 130,000 youth in that country. How come no politician has ever mentioned about this deadly dilemma that we're facing?
Boy, you expect me to answer a question of why politicians do what they do? No, but you are 100% correct. We have determined that the Intel community, open source press, it has determined that just like a majority of our prescription drugs comes from China, they have the capability, and we can track the transshipment rates that do cross the border. So, and it is a horrific scourge that's going on in the country. I have friends who are undertakers, and it's in New England, and it's just frightening the damage it's doing everywhere. So I think a to-do is for everyone to write their senator, congressman, and ask them this question.
Thank you, Ed. We so much appreciate your coming back, and we look forward to your next visit. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda.
Everybody, thank you for being with us. We hope you enjoyed today's program. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and we look forward to seeing you next month, December 12th. Thank you and good day.